Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Dr. Janna Heyman. I am with the Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service, and I am a professor as well as a chair of the Ravison Center on Aging and Intergenerational Studies. And our panel today is composed of many individuals that have done a lot of work with disabilities. And I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, who is Xiaoran Wang, who is a social work doctoral candidate at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service. And she will be talking to us today on her presentation on social inclusion, perceptions and support seeking experiences among parents of young children with autism in Beijing. So welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Heyman. I will quickly share my slides. Does it look good? Okay, great. First, thank you. It's my great honor to be here to share my study with you. And my study is about Chinese parents, the perception on social inclusion, and also their support-seeking experience in Beijing, China, those parents with young children with autism. Very briefly, I would like to introduce what autism is. So autism, as known as autism spectrum disorders, is a group of a developmental disorder. So people with autism also have often have communication in social communication and interaction, presenting repetitive behaviors patterns. Autism is known as a spectrum, so the severity of symptoms people experience vary. You may hear the term Asperger's syndrome, which refers to high functional autism with normal intellectual and language development. The early signs of autism, such as avoiding eye contact, language delay, sleeping disorders, often appears in the first and the second years of a child. Early intervention is critically important for children with autism. With timely and effective early intervention, many children with autism can adapt to a regular school setting and live out of disabling condition. Commonly, early intervention approach include behavior therapy such as ABA, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and physical therapy. So children with autism and their families in China. The diagnosis of autism came to mainland China in 1982. In recent years, the number of children diagnosed with autism increased. The prevalence rate was up to 1 in 100 among the school-age children. And previous studies show difficulties the parents experience, including public negative attitudes towards autism, lack of intervention services, rejection from preschool and school, and also having little financial support for early intervention. But in recent years, that there are some policy improvement. For example, in 2017, the regulation on the education of persons with disabilities were amended. This law mandates the 9 years compulsory education and also specify that studying in regular classroom should be the main resolution for education resolution for children with disabilities. And in the same years, there's another law called the Disability Prevention and Disabled People's Rehabilitation Regulation. This is the first national law to create a national system for disability prevention and rehabilitation. And also is regulated that the fees on the early intervention should be covered by the public medical insurance programs. So in this context, I would like to revisit parents' the perceptions and the support-seeking experience to know that to what extent that they feel more included in these societies. And I would like to identify the most recent changes, persistent issues, and also potential change makers in current context. So the concept of social inclusion in my papers refer to parents' participation and a sense of belonging in society. My study includes 12 parents with children under 9 years old with autism in Beijing. They were recruited through established relationship with the early intervention service providers, and I also rely on parents' snowballing introduction. The sample, as you see, were dominated by mothers and also parents with a master or a doctoral degree. So the findings that may not apply to low-income families with children with autism. Semi-structured interviews were conducted in person or by phone according to parents' preferences, and my interviews that last 2 hours in average to know their experience in depth. In the following slides that I will summarize the main findings. I will get started from the progress that I observed. That first of all, on that previous study, found that parents feel ashamed of autism as a mental disorder. A few parents in this study surprisingly perceive autism not as a mental disorder, but as a developmental disorder over differences. So like a mother said, autism is a developmental disorder that can be corrected like myopia with contact lenses. It's not a shame to hide from people. Other mother mentioned that describing autism as a developmental barrier helped her to communicate with the parents of the typical children, so they won't be turned away by the symptoms, autistic symptoms of his son present. So the parents' understanding of autism really reflects their perception that they expect an inclusive society accommodating the differences of their children with autism. I also found that early intervention service market is developing very fast in Beijing. The issue of lacking early intervention services reported by previous studies since has been lessened. There were a variety of intervention services are available for parents to choose from. Both the agency-based and the service providers, private service providers are available, and some parents also join on-site and online parenting program to learn hand-on intervention skills. Very significantly that I found early education is developing in Beijing, which has not yet reported much in previous study. Parents told me that inclusive preschool emerging in recent years that not only provide early intervention on site, but also they encourage the interaction between children with autism and the typical children. So a mother said that he was really warmed by the interaction between his son and other kids. He said his son was surrounded by love every day. And there are a couple of parents further mentioned that inclusive preschools are developing collaborative relationship with a general preschool, which improve the awareness of autism among teachers in general education setting. In addition, previous study in China found that parents with children with disability tended not to develop the relationship with other peer parents because they did not want to burden each other. But in my study, all parents actively involved in the peer parents communities, either in person or online. A father said that the peer parents, they stay together to keep warm, answer each other's questions, check in daily basis, and further develop long-term friendship. It is also notable that I hear a mother pointed out that parents should not only limit themselves within the peer parents group. That is because as she talked about parenting with parents with typical children, she found that both the typical children and the autistic children have some common behaviors or problem. So he worried less about her own kids' behaviors. So she suggests that it is important to keep the regular friendship with the parents with typical children. Next, I will present the persistent issue I found. First, as previous study indicate, negative early intervention market is difficult without support from governments and profession. The growing early intervention market further increased the difficulty because parents they try very hard, but still they cannot search service information systematically and comprehensively without the support from government or other guidance from the profession. For example, a couple of parents, they did not know that the neighborhood already have very well-known early intervention agency. Instead, they run to agency far away from their home. And also, as a father said, the full process is full of the whole process is full of anxiety. It's because there's no guidance and everyone wants the best. She visited different agencies, but what is the agency, to what extent this agency can help his son is hard to know by just a visit. So he was quite anxious about the service navigation. And the other issue is the cost of early intervention. This cost has not yet covered by the public medical programs. So the financial burden was really heavy for most families, even for those the family in middle class. So they have a very good education background, but it still feel very difficult, especially when job loss occur or other family member fall ill. They have to live on the saving. But notably, parents in my sample have a strong sense of a long-term planning. So a few parents mentioned they intentionally reduce the short-term early intervention cost so that they could support their children in a long term. And even a father considered that he may have to implement early intervention at home as a cost-saving strategy. The persistent issue also appears in the general early education. Parents were very disappointed when their children were left alone, marginalized, blamed, or even punished in general education. So a couple of parents also report that general education setting emphasize the disciplining behaviors and academic performance, which troubles their children having difficulties in behaviors control and learning as good as the typical children. In addition, stigma is another persistent issue. I found this that when parents talk about their opinions on this disability certificate. So in China, if parents obtain medical diagnosis of autism from doctors, they can apply a disability certificate for their child. The certificate qualifies the child to receive some early intervention service with reduced fee. But some parents choose not to do so because it's concern over the stigma. A mother worried that the neighbors will know her son's condition because the application have to go through the local community committees. And a couple of parents notice they worry the freedom of their children in the future. If they hold the certificate, they may have difficulties to buy flight ticket. But what contract is that I found two parents, they already obtained the certificate and did not have the same worry. They saw this as a legal protection. So if their children make trouble in the future because of a problem behavior or communication difficulty, the certificate can protect their children from any lawsuit. And it is possible that parents with children with a severe autism may consider disability certificate as a protection more than a stigma. At last, negative public opinions towards autism persist, and some social expectation also put pressures on parents. So one aspect is the expectation of a normal children development. Parents struggles with the feeling that my children left in behind. And other aspects includes the public attitudes toward children, proper behaviors, and also the public misunderstanding of autism. And the parents were often nervous when they were outside because others will blame their children's problem behaviors and contribute the behaviors to their poor parenting practice. And facing these issues, parenting identified the government as the significant change maker. They expect the government further promote inclusive education and make a good use of social media for public education. But parents in Beijing were aware that they must rely most on their own strengths, even though the policy development is very promising. So as a mother said that he definitely wants the society will get better, but she had to work hard and accumulated resources so that she can create a more opportunity for his son. And what encouraged is that the professional frontline workers are found making a big difference to develop an inclusive society. And like a mother said, before he think about the disability certificate, he felt that it was the label. She was quite nervous to apply. But once she stepped into the community service center and the social workers there said to her that no worry, our son will get better. So she said, I experienced knows nothing about discrimination. I used to think it will be bad for having a son like him, but now I no longer think so. This study also called for establishing a service support system in China, including social workers, community workers, and other human service professionals. They can promote a more inclusive societies in the areas of public education, service navigation, program intake and services, parenting support, and disability right advocacy. This is the overall of my study. Thank you very much for your listening. I would like to answer any question and also welcome any comments you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. We are going to hold the questions until all the panelists have spoken. So I really appreciate your insights, and we're learning a lot from that research. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Peters from the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And she is with the School of Global Inclusion and Social Development. She will also introduce her colleagues' work who has collaborated with her on this project as well. So thank you. The title is The Experiences of Married Women in Palestine Who Acquire a Disability, Polygamy, Divorce, and Banishment. Thank you, Dr. Peter.
Thank you, Jenna. So welcome everybody. I'd just like to say that this work I have done that we're talking about today has been, the data was collected by my colleague, Dr. Itaf Elkhateeb, who is having some technical difficulties in joining us today. But I did want to acknowledge that much of the work is hers, so thank you.
Thank you.
So the study. So the research question for the study was, what are the experiences of Palestinian women who acquire a disability after marriage? And this was part of a larger study looking at the experience of women with disabilities in Palestine. And so, you know, women with disabilities are largely sort of hidden within the home. So it's not easy to get a sample, but so really it was who we were able to connect through networking. And the participants were primarily in Gaza. There was an in-depth interview of 13 women with mild to moderate disabilities aged between 26 and 50. And they had a range of disabilities. So, and I've listed them there. So they're not, there was no particular focus on a type of disability. I want to give you a bit of a background about Palestine. Although Palestine has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Palestinian Authority, which is ostensibly the government there, and the world is on the political entanglements. So like that's where all the focus and the energy is going at the moment. And so marginalized populations within the nation state are basically a secondary consideration at the moment. And so within Palestine, the necessities for survival, such as ongoing access to water, food, electricity, housing, and physical safety, as well as access to life-saving medicines, are constant issues within Palestine. And so the focus is very much for families on those issues. And in the larger context, the unemployment rate of people in Palestine generally is 44%, and for female employment, the female participation rate in work is just 19%. So what we found when we looked at this smaller cohort of women who were married and then obtained or acquired a disability, only 2 women out of the 13 remained happily married. And so really the reality for most was that these women were either divorced or chose divorce, or had to enter into an arrangement with a second wife in the family. And this was really very distressing for the women. So 2 were divorced and 1 woman was separated, and then the 10 remained married after the onset of the impairment. And 8 of the 10 women believed that their functioning was severely curtailed, not by their loss of physical capacity, but by social exclusion and denial of their participation as a sexual partner and homemaker and mother. And all but 1 of the women believed they had the physical capacity to fulfill the role of sexual partner, homemaker and mother. The most distressing issue was husbands taking a second wife. And of the 10 participants still married, only 2 husbands or families were not considering taking a second wife. For 9 interviews, for 9 interviewees, their husbands took a second wife, or there was pressure from the family for them to take a second wife. And so just to give you a sense of the sorts of feelings that the women expressed, my need is to be with my husband and family without this other wife. I'm not fine with him having a second wife. She replaces me in everything. She goes with him to all the social events and I stay at home. I can't accept that. It's so painful to me. He lives with his second wife and I just stay with him to be with my son. And so this arrangement had huge quality of life implications. So another woman said, we, women with disabilities, are supposed to have reproductive rights like any other woman. My husband left me just because I can't walk. He's afraid that I'll not be able to have children because of my disease. To become disabled for me means that my life is ended. Not being able to return to my husband is a disaster. Just another one to capture it. My right is to be able to live with my husband alone without another wife. I left my husband because he married another wife. This is not fair for me. My life became difficult with my blindness in addition to living with another wife. This made me return to my family and I had to leave my children with him. I'm not happy without my children. Blindness makes my life difficult, difficult as it is. I can't see that because of the thing, but you get the sense of the difficulties these women are facing. And one of the, a number of women said, I felt exactly like a piece of furniture in my husband's home. And another used that same metaphor. I feel like an old used piece of furniture in the house, implying that they felt like an object that didn't demand respect or consideration, an object that has no feelings, rights, or choices. So then what are the implications for social policy? So I think one of the big issues that came out of this study was that women with disabilities claims to rights are not made in the public sphere, but within the domestic sphere, which is very different from the West, where policy focuses on the public domain. So, the domestic sphere is really their world. And so then disablement is magnified then by the economic and political mayhem. So unemployment, poverty, lack of opportunities, all this kind of indicated that women are economically dependent on others, and in particular men. And so, economically, they either needed to be within their husband's family or their birth family. And there is no, and they considered themselves to be a burden when they were when they went back to their birth family. The other thing is that, it's really clear that disablement is also an outcome of these cultural obstructions. And these are very sort of culturally specific norms and stereotypes about women with disabilities, and these cultural expectations about roles and sexuality. And so these, culture is often kind of an invisible issue, that it isn't, the light doesn't shine on it in a lot of research, but here these cultural issues are really very clear. And then the next point is that it's vital that social policies consider the intersectional aspect of the experiences of women with disabilities. So it's like this intersection is the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage based on being both a woman and a person with a disability. And so the experience for men with disabilities was very different. They were expected to marry a woman without a disability, and they did. So the women's movement alone, nor the disabled persons movement alone, can fully understand and respond to the positionality of these women. And also that is true in social policy, that policies for women and policies for persons with disabilities will help, but the particular experience of these women need to be addressed uniquely. And finally, it's clear that multi-level interventions are needed, not just policy and legislation at the international and state level. So, you know, we do have the Convention on the Rights of Women and Persons with Disabilities. And then, you know, there are disability-related laws in Palestine, but there needs to be more support for self-advocacy for women with disabilities. They're isolated, they're not connected with each other. There needs to be education of the professionals who support women with disabilities, many of whom have the same men and who have the same attitudes as their husbands. And that is my presentation, and I look forward to any questions at the end of the next presentation. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. I think that you have raised some important issues as well, and we look forward to some of the questions that will help us even understand more about your research. So thank you. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker is PhD candidate Justine Hervé. She is with the Graduate Schools of Arts and Science in Economic Department, and she is going to talk with us today about violence against women with disabilities in the Global South, evidence from the Demographic and Health Survey. Thank you. Welcome, Justine.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen first. So, sorry. Can you all see my screen? Yeah, perfect. So thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be able to present the results of our work today, actually for the first time. So this is the result of joint work with Sophie Mitra. And today in this presentation, I'm going to tell you about violence against women with disabilities in the Global South. And we're bringing evidence here from a quantitative analysis done in the context of a multi-country study. So to introduce this topic, I chose to mention a pretty telling, but also a pretty alarming statistics in the world. 35% of women have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence. So as of now, from now on, I will refer to intimate partner violence as IPV. And this subject recently has been given even more attention with the rise of the prevalence rate of violence since the beginning of the pandemic. So this has already been even documented by in the literature by Steliano and Oge or Cousin in 2020. And so facing those observations, like it seems kind of obvious that if we want to build adequate policy responses to actually decrease the prevalence rates of violence, we need to identify the consistent risk factors of violence to be able to tackle them. Now, if we focus on the population of women who actually experience domestic violence, there is actually still little recognition of a group of women that are actually, however, most at risk of violence, and this is the group of women with disabilities. So the image I show you right below was actually produced by an English think tank that works to advocate women's rights. And what this image is pretty much the main message of the image is that women with disabilities are on average 2 times more likely to experience domestic violence. However, this is not an academic review, and it's only like the results from a single study. So there is more need, like we need more work on this subject to actually like get a consistent estimate of the prevalence rate of violence for women with disabilities. So the main takeaway here is that disability remains like an understudied factor of vulnerability towards intimate partner violence. Like we already have evidence, but most of the evidence is either country specific. So we don't know if disability is a consistent factor of vulnerability across at a more global scale. And many studies also like work with pretty small samples, like which presents difficulty for external validity, for instance. So to illustrate this point a little better, like let me take you through the literature that explored domestic violence and the relationship of domestic violence with disability. So on the determinants of domestic violence, like I'm showing you here a few studies that are like country specific. So in Haiti, Xiaoran Wang like identify risk factors of domestic violence that are both like that are simultaneously at the individual, household, partner, and relationship level. The most striking risk factors they identify are history of parental violence, women's attitudes, accepting attitudes towards wife beating, or consumption of alcohol by the partner. In India, Roy Chaudhary et al. And others like Endas Gupta focus more specifically on young age marriage and attitudes towards violence, and they also identify a positive correlation between those two factors and violence. And finally, in Uganda, Kwagala and others like are probably the closest to what we're going to do here in our study. They show that disabled women are 1.3 to 1.7 more likely to experience IPV. Now, if we now turn to studies, multi-countries that are in a multi-country framework, like that investigate the link between domestic violence and disability, there's not so much evidence in the literature, but I'm showing you here 2 examples of such studies. Hughes et al., Hughes and others, like perform a meta-analysis of 26 studies that are each country specific, that investigate the relationship between IPV and violence. And their main conclusion is that the odds ratio for the probability of domestic violence for disabled women compared to non-disabled women is 1.5. It means that disabled women are 1.5 times at higher risk of domestic violence than non-disabled women. In another study, a cross-country analysis of 6 countries with a sample of more or less 4,500 women, Dunkel and others also compute an odds ratio of violence for disabled women, and they find that disabled women are 2 to 4 times at higher risk of IPV compared to non-disabled women. So what you see here is that there's also already like a gap between those 2 estimates, right? And I'll come back to that later because that's one of the motivations of our study. Now, on the consequences of domestic violence, like because if it's important to identify the determinants of violence, it's also important to quantify the consequences. Most of the literature as of now has been focusing on the consequences of IPV on mental health. So either on depressive disorders and suicidality for Beidoun et al. And Laughlin et al., or on children's human capital, like for Assad in 2013. However, like there's still new studies, and the last one I'm presenting you here, Chaudhary et al., is one of those. Like some new studies investigate the consequence of violence on the physical health of women. And so on that topic, Chaudhary et al. Work in Nepal, and they try to investigate the relationship between the intensity of violence and the gravity of injuries experienced by women. Now, the main takeaway of the studies I presented up to now, like, and especially the main takeaway from the meta study of Hughes et al., is that there's still little evidence on the correlation between IPV and disability in the global south. So we have some evidence in the global north, but it's more rare, like in the global south. Additionally, like Hughes et al. Highlight that we have little comparable cross cross-country statistics on the relationship between IPV and disability, which means that even like in different countries, different questions are being asked on disability, different questions on violence, which means that if we get an odds ratio of violence like in one country, it's not necessarily comparable with what we got in another setting. So that's the first question we are trying to answer here. Is disability a consistent correlate of IPV across countries of the Global South? And we are able to answer this question because of the characteristics of the data we use. Now, the second question we try to answer is, does disability increase the risk of injuries for disabled women? So I'm going to pass on the contributions because I don't know if I'm going to have enough time, but to answer the first question, like we use data from the demographic health surveys, like from 7 countries. Like the reason we use this data set and the main added value of this data set, which is also the main added value of our study actually, is that the demographic health survey helps for the implementation of surveys like in many countries all around the world, and they ask harmonized questions on a diversity of topics, among which violence and disability. What this means is that in Cambodia, Colombia, Haiti, Mali, South Africa, Pakistan, or Uganda, the same questions were asked on what types of violence women experience, the intensity of violence they experience, and also what types of disability or functional difficulties they experience. So for disability, they always use the Washington Group short sets of questions on functional difficulties. So that's good, that's convenient for us because it's going to allow us to produce statistics on the prevalence of violence that we can compare across countries. And so another, like our final sample is actually 50,000 women, which is a very big sample to investigate this relationship between violence and disability, given the fact that samples of women with disability are usually like of small sizes. So our final sample is 50,000 women aged 15 to 49 years old. Now, on the data, on the methodology we use in this study, this is mainly a quantitative study. I'm not going to take you through all those details. The main thing you should remember from this slide is that to investigate the relationship between violence and disability, I'm going to regress on the left-hand side here the probability of violence on a a binary indicator that takes the value 1 if you declared having any functional difficulty in any of the domains identified by the Washington group. So this is the first part of our quantitative analysis. Like in a second time, I'm going to use this specification to investigate the link between the risk of injury and violence. So on the left side, I'm going to regress the intensity or the gravity of injuries on the intensity of violence a woman experienced. So let me now take you through the results. This first slide that I'm showing you is a bar graph that presents on the y-axis the prevalence of functional difficulties among women aged 15 to 49 in all of those 7 countries that we're using in our study. And what we see is that the prevalence rate of functional difficulties in my sample ranges from 2% in Colombia all the way to 30% in Pakistan. This number is actually pretty telling. It's telling us that, for instance, in Pakistan, 1 out of 3 women experience functional difficulties. It's a substantive part of the population. Now, turning to the prevalence of domestic violence, this graphic that you see on this slide is showing you the prevalence rate of domestic violence also among the population of women 15 plus in the 7 countries. And the picture you see here is actually pretty alarming. It's telling you that in South Africa, 22% were a victim of either physical or sexual abuse. And in Uganda, that prevalence is actually 53%. So if we want to interpret it, like it means that in Uganda, 1 out of 2 women were victim of domestic violence during their lifetime, either by their current partner or previous partner. Now, let's try to now connect like disability with violence. This new graphic I'm showing you is showing you on the y-axis, same thing, the prevalence of violence, so the percentage of women in each sample who experience domestic violence. And I'm disaggregating the population of women in each country by grouped by two different groups. The group of women with no disability, that's the red dots here, and the group of women with some disability, that's the green circles. And what we observe here, the most striking fact of this slide is that the prevalence rate of violence, or like the green circle, is systematically higher than the red dot, which means that women, that prevalence rate of violence is systematically higher in the population of women with functional difficulties. No, this is just a bivariate analysis, so to dig a little deeper, we need to move to multivariate analysis, which is what you see in this slide. So in this slide, it's showing you the point estimates for the coefficient on disability when I regress violence on a disability. So pretty much it's telling you like the risk of violence for women with disability compared to women with no disability. And each dot represents a different country. What we observe here is that those dots are systematically higher than 1, and most of them are statistically significant at the 95% level. 2 of them are not, but I'm not going to go through the details of that. It's a problem of statistical power, mainly because we have small samples. But what does this mean? Like, it means that in average, that's the main result of the study, women with disabilities are 1.3 to 1.5 times more likely to experience domestic violence than women without disabilities. So that's what you should remember from this slide. Now, let's try to disaggregate actually disability itself into the domains of disability, right? Because the Washington short set of questions actually ask questions on 6 types of functional difficulties: seeing, hearing, communicating, concentrating, walking, and washing. So let's see how those difficulties individually relate to the probability to experience domestic violence. Each of those points are also point estimates on the correlation between a certain type of difficulty and violence. And what do we see here? There's something that really comes out on this picture, is that the odds ratio for difficulty communicating seems much higher than the rest. This, if we want to interpret that, it means that women who have difficulty communicating or difficulty concentrating here seems at particularly higher risk of domestic violence than women with more physical difficulties. So that's another result of our study. Now, let's turn to the consequences of injury, of violence. Yeah, I'm going to try to wrap up.
Thank you. Do you want to sum that up in your slide now?
Yeah, I just have to go to this one, through this one and the conclusion, and I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this almost last slide is showing you the coefficient size when I regress the gravity of injury on the intensity of violence. The main takeaway is that this coefficient is positive, superior to 0, and statistically significant for all countries across all subsamples. So women with disability or women without disability. This means that the intensity of violence is positively correlated or increases the gravity of injuries for all women, whether they are disabled or non-disabled, in all countries. So to conclude, the motivation of this study is that up to now, we have little cross-country evidence on the relationship between disability and domestic violence that allow us to compare the odds ratio across countries. To kind of fill this gap, we use cross-sectional data on more than 50,000 women from 7 different countries to quantitatively investigate the relationship between disability and IPV. And our 2 main results is that actually women with functional difficulties are more likely to experience domestic violence, and that IPV, domestic violence itself, significantly increases the risk of injuries. Now, in terms of policy implications, what does this mean? It probably means, that's my second point here, that when we think about violence prevention, we should probably target violence prevention for women with disabilities, since they seem to be a particularly vulnerable population facing this issue. Perhaps we could even go further and say that we should target violence prevention for women with cognitive difficulties or difficulty communicating or concentrating. That's it. for my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I know there'll be some questions to help us understand some of that work even further. So I want to just open it up. We have a number of questions that have come in. And Sharon, one of the first questions was a little bit about, could you give us an understanding of how accessible early childhood interventions are to parents who are in the lower to middle income?
Yes, thank you for the question. I get some insight from my participant about how the low-income family meet the needs of early intervention. One thing is that they can apply the certificate, the disability certificate, which eligible them to receive about up to 3,000 RMB, reduce the cost of early intervention. That's help a lot. And one other approach is to use some agency provide services in cheaper cost, cheaper price, which can also reduce the monthly fee. But there is an issue is because those agencies, because they are cheap, so there are a lot of clients, children and parents with reduced the quality of the service. And also they may have a difficulty to keep a good therapist because they receive less income and they pay less. So this is the issue for the low-income family. They need the most support, but they cannot access to high quality early intervention in this market. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Peters, there was a question particularly about understanding a little bit more about the individuals that you studied, particularly the women being married, with regarding to how long they have experienced disabilities. If you could just maybe give us a little further insight into that aspect.
Thank you so much for the question. So our research study was, the research question was really exploring the experiences of women with disabilities in Palestine. So our research model doesn't really answer any longitudinal question. That's not how it was designed. We did ask how long that person has had a disability, and it varied between 2 years and 25 years. But there was no indication that things got better over time. And in fact, there was a sense that the mental health of the women were deteriorating with the advent of the second wife. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. There was another question, and I think it touches on all three of your work. And Justine, if you want to start by responding, it really asks more, what do we need to do in terms of culture and understanding culture and the importance of intersectionality, as you know, you reflected on it for IPV, different countries. What do we need to do to shape and understand some future work?
In the context of our study, like I think like in our case, like the idea is more to understand that women with disabilities like are vulnerable towards IPV in any context. Like that this is something that you could that is not just true in Cambodia or Haiti, or and that therefore if like if we think of like policy making, like we could even think of like more global interventions, not just context specifically.
Thank you. And Dr. Peter, do you want to respond to that too? I know you talked about intersectionality quite a bit and shaping, you know, the future concerns and issues.
Yes, you know, I think culture and the relationship between culture and disability is a really important relationship that we haven't sort of explored enough in our research. And in terms of, you know, we could see that Pakistan in Ms. Hervé's presentation was really high and really low in other countries. But I think the take home here is that we don't look enough at culture and then sort of direct our efforts in a culturally specific way to minimize the negative impacts of disablement. I think that's the takeaway, and that you know, these things have a phenomenal impact on people with disabilities, but we just kind of brush culture aside. But we need to be embracing the culture and then thinking about how we can work within a particular culture.
Thank you. And Professor Wang, do you want to add to that as well?
For my study, parents are really concerned about the cultural issue related stigma attached to mental illness. So I think in China, the most critical task is to educate the public about what is the autism, and to make parents feel that even though my child have autism, but the societies can embrace the differences. And regarding the intersectionality, the poverty did put the parents with children with autism in a more disadvantaged stage, the status, and the regulate early intermarket is very important. And parents said the early intervention is heavily profit driven, and so the low income family is marginalized. So government's regulation is critically important to reduce the disparities. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And just while we're talking about that, another question that came up as well, particular, Sharon, to your study, is have you, I know you did this work in Beijing, have you looked at, is there other programs and services, and how have you thought about it? I know this is a big ask from, but in terms of rural areas as well.
Yeah. The regional disparities is another issue in China. In rural area, parents have to travel a long distance to the big city. There are recent policy coming out to give some stipend for people from rural area and also low-income family, so that they can afford the early intervention services in big city. But in general, the service is not quite available in rural area in China.
Okay, thank you. Very, very helpful. Are there other questions you can put in the chat? We will try to respond to them. But I think I do want to echo one comment that came through, is that all of you gave us an amazing presentation and insight into important issues that we are addressing with children, with married women, and, you know, understanding violence. And I think when we look at all of these three presentations together, what do each of you feel are important takeaways? Because I think that is, you know, very helpful that you've heard from other speakers on the panel. Is there something that sparked your interest in your work? And Dr. Peter, can I start with you? Oh, I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. So yes, so I think one of the things that is really challenging for social policy, and I think this relates to Justine's study too, is that policies in the West are really focused on the public, the sort of the larger citizenship. And it's clear that for many women in many countries that actually their world is in the domestic sphere. And so the relationship between domestic sphere and policies is really under, well, first of all, we don't have experience with it in the West. And, you know, in a country like Palestine, you know, there's other things that are distracting them from looking at marginalized populations. But I think we've got a very rich opportunity to understand the relationship between the domestic sphere and policy and how we can make changes within that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That is a very strong and important statement. Justine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, when I was listening to Professor Peter's presentation, I was also thinking that, like, further than, like, even further than thinking about disability, like one way, like one important way, like, to fix this problem is probably, it's like one of the main problem is probably an issue of gender norms and empowerment, right? Like, because it's the interaction of having a disability with those pre-existing issues that generate those situations. Like, so even if it's in the domestic sphere, you know, like if gender roles were like distributed differently, but that's like the experience of disability itself, like, would probably be quite different. The experience of violence also, of course, like would be different. So
Thank you. Thank you. And Sharon, did you want to add in closing?
I'm really impressed by the studies of my Professor Peter and Justine. One really impressed me is about the family focus perspective, and I see the Justine talking about the domestic violence and Dr. Peter talking about the relationship between women with disability and the husband. And I think my sample as well, those families encounter great challenges within their family realm, but the policy usually focus on certain type of services or certain programs, but the families as a whole need support, and maybe certain family therapy can help them, or the whole society can not only treat the social issue individually, but also can resolve these issues in a family realm, so the different programs can deliver to the family, so the relationship can improve.
Thank you. And I really want to thank the audience. Thank you for coming and listening to these amazing and powerful studies that really, I think when we think about research, it starts to begin and really has to understand how it can shape practice, how it can shape policy for the future of individuals and families across the lifespan. So thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing more about your work. Take care now.